Hi, and welcome back to part 3 of the Cloud Automation Quick Start walkthrough. And as I ended off the last session, I had mentioned going into a custom workflow and kind of how you would use the Node-RED and the CAA for internal management of addresses, setting up your own APIs, and potentially interfacing with other external processes like Snow or ServiceNow, setting up through workflows or any other type of orchestration. So what we want to design here and what we have is I have a add IP workflow that allows the input to specify details about the device, like what type of device, what the VLAN ID is, and some other attributes like domain, etc. Has the workflow, it logs in the user. It then creates a query string, which this query string is effectively going to determine what subnets have a user-definable field called VLAN ID that equals the VLAN ID we're looking for, or input from the payload. And we also want to make sure that the API is enabled, and that for that subnet that the API is enabled to be used. So what I have in IP control as an example, I have a couple of user-defined fields that are specified for my blocks. So these need to be available to your subnets. And I have one called VLAN ID, which the display ID is VLAN space ID, and the field name tag, which is how it's stored in the database, and also how you reference it in APIs and or CLIs, command line interfaces, or imports, is through the field name tag. So this needs to be kind of database compliant, no spaces, extraneous characters. So something like VLAN underscore ID. So I try to make my fields as a hint map to their display titles since I don't necessarily know what the field name is from the display. So if I make them the same but changing spaces to underscores and things, I can somewhat assimilate what that'll be in this APIs. And then more importantly, that you associate it to whatever UDF, and that the UDF that you're going to assign or manage is set for the container that you're going to manage these blocks in. So for this particular demonstration of this workflow that we're developing, I'm working with some subnets in my Atlanta virtual office, and the containers that I want to have set up in the user-defined fields are going to be subnet underscore UDF. So each of the types that I have enabled, the data and stuff for this site, here are the valid block types, have a template set up and established through the subnet UDF. And so when I have a subnet, I have API enabled, the VLAN, VLAN ID, some Google information to concatenate to make a URL, right? Pretty straightforward. So in those subnets, what I have, and so that we can demonstrate this effectively, I have set the VLAN ID to be the same in all three subnets. And that's something you would typically do. But if you are organizing subnets together, you might have an ID that groups them in terms of like these are virtual subnets available for the API provisioning, as an example. So this may not be a VLAN ID, but in this regard it is. So we're going to use VLAN ID 11111 all the way across, and two of these subnets are enabled and one of these is off. Okay, so when I input into this request, I'm going to specify a quantity, and I'm going to read that in through the payload. I'm going to set up a query that looks for the VLAN ID and that it's enabled. I'm then going to remove the username password just for security purposes. I don't need it anymore. I won't even really have it in this when I assign it because we're using the DID basic authentication. And then I have the VLAN ID that we're going to set in some other variables that we're going to load, the device type, domain name, host name, and then we're going to pull back the request headers so that we can effectively set that information there. So once that is set, it's going to create an export of the subnets that match that criteria. That export then is going to be split. So each subnet is going to be passed through a split, and we're then going to create some additional variables such as the URL. We're going to modify the headers and add those so that we can then query the get block by address calculate status. So get deployed block by IP address calculate stats is the name of the API. It's rather long, and it uses the JSON data to create this string based on pulling out the message payload child block adder from the split string, right? So every one of the subnets that's in the export gets passed through this. It creates a URL set by this block adder, passes that into this HTTP request node. So anywhere in your flows, you can inject an HTTP request to query an external API. And in this case, we're going to inject a HTTP request get node. The URL is going to be set programmatically by the change rule. And we want to make sure that we enable TLS and then disable the key and certificate, because we're going to just ignore the self sign. And the return is going to be a parsed JSON object, which you have choices if you wanted to structure this through a string or a buffer. And so the name of this is, of course, that, and it's going to call that. And the result of this is then going to be passed through a change node where we're going to calculate and set of an available property in the payload that's going to be set through the JSON data to create a available quantity. So message payload, num, address, host, these are the properties it pulls out, creates the available, and then does the same thing with the percent, and then deletes the remaining URLs not to conflict it moving forward. Once it's done that, it then joins all of this records together. So all of the splits, it waits until all of the splits are complete, all of the messages are processed, and the join sees the very last message. So the split injects, this is the last message of the split. It knows to join that, which it then does into an array, and that array is then sorted, and we're going to sort it by the element value, so in ascending. And the very last part of that is we're then going to create a device array. So effectively what I'm doing here then is I'm showing and demonstrating how in your workflows you can do nodes that do all of this calculation for you based on change and switches, and like we've done so far. But you can also have function nodes that are pure JavaScript that can process the data, again, using the message as the message.payload input that you can then format, construct your own output, and send the result output to the message flow, which allows it to carry on through the next message. So what I'm doing here, just so we can quickly see, is I'm carrying a variable blocks, which is going to be our payload, so that we store it in the local JavaScript. I'm going to set up an array of available, which is going to be basically push the blocks there. And then I'm going to set up a request quantity. So what I'm going to do is effectively go through the different blocks, and it's going to check the percent that if it's greater than or equal to 5%, and the available is greater than the quantity, to push it into this array to make it available. Right. So the first thing we do is make sure that that quantity and percent is up. And I might actually want to do this as 10 or even 20%, just to give myself some buffer programmatically. Once it's done with this for loop of the blocks and has added them to the available, it then just walks through the selection, and we're going to grab the first one. So I'm just going to grab it here, but I could do some other logic. I could go in and say, what's your available, which one ever is greatest I'm going to take, and so on. So we could do that, and I might come back and do that as well. So then we're going to set the message block selection to whatever selected block is, so the structure of that block. And then we're going to set message avail to a message avail. So that way we can see it in the debug, and we can do something else with it if we wish. Now the last thing we want to do here is we want to create an array based on the quantity supplied to us in the payload for each of the individual IP addresses that are then going to be imported in the next procedure. So in this particular process then, we're going to loop through the quantity, and we're going to set up a new array of this import device, and we're going to set the import device parameters based on what's in the message import, and also based on how we want this assigned. So host name, we're going to pull it out of the message host name, which was added up in one of the change nodes. This will be static. We want the selected block adder from start, telling it we want to allocate IP addresses from the start of the subnet. And we want the container basically to be the first container in whatever selected block we chose. Blocks can be attached to multiple containers, but the first container is typically the first ID to be assigned, so we'll take that as the default. The input device domain name we would then set to be your domain to create the resource records and device type of server in this case. And then we're going to push that into another array that's then going to be effectively added to the payload, right? So this will be, the payload will be an array of device ads that'll be assigned and sent to the next node. So here, what I've done is I've used a link. So this is a link is effectively, instead of having all these wires wired all over the place, there's a link node that has an output link, like I have here, taking the output, and then you can have an input link that you can have somewhere else in a different flow or even on the same flow, and you wire these together by selecting which one you want it to be wired to. And that'll then wire the input output together so that you can, pass messages through flows or within the same flow neatly, organizing it. So basically, when that array of addresses gets assigned, it gets passed to the split node, which again processes each individual element array element into the import device. And the import device creates an IP address, and then effectively what happens is it's only the IP that gets returned in this structure, in this format. So we're going to set the return IP address, which is the result of that import, and we're going to move it into the payload. The payload then runs the IP get device, which allows it basically to get the details about that IP information, and then we move some other details into the message block selection to get it out of the payload and so forth. So, or into the payload so we can actually see what the block is, for the details. We join all of this back together, so now we have one message with the subnet information and also the new IP and its details. We sort it and then we output it. So that's quite extensive in terms of a flow. But in terms of the result, we expect that we should get, any number of addresses with their DNS names auto-generated and the details of the subnet, which also contains hopefully information about the gateway and other information. So I want to do that real quick and make sure it does. And in the policies, let's do 3.1. Let's set this to, the primary DNS, DHCP. We'll do IP control int, 192. And we'll do this one here. And we'll do the same for this. Okay. And to demonstrate this, I think I'll use the Postman because I have something set up here. And this will give you a different kind of feel of how you can test this as well. So in Postman, effectively what you want to do is you want to create a new endpoint or post API. And the endpoint you want to read is the IP address 1880 and our workflow IP. So 192.168.1.56 1880/workflow/add IP should map to our workflow in the other screens. Okay. Now the parameters that we're going to use here, I'm not going to specify any parameters. I'm actually going to do it through the body. Okay, so first of all, you don't need to worry about that. Authorization though, what we do want to set up is the authorization that allows us to work, and that'll be basic auth. Now within here, you can have this automatically set your password and username so you don't have to expose it. And then you can preview that request, which will be in the headers, and it'll tell you, here's your basic auth string. All right, so that's the first thing we want to do. The second part of this is in the header, we want to make sure that you have the content type. And in this should be the x-www-form-URL encoded. Because we're going to pass in basically that type of data within the body structure. Now, one thing about Postman is you can bulk edit this information. So you can edit this in a string and cut and paste it and do whatever you need to here, and add or delete these fields. So I'm going to actually take these out since we're going to use that information elsewhere. I'm going to also take out state since I already have this developed. But what I do want to have is a VLAN ID. I want it to pass a 1111, and I want to say I want 5 servers. I want this to read IP control int, since that's my domain. And then what I'm going to tell it is to generate a host name based on the server type and that policy. So what you want to make sure of, this will not work if you do this or don't do this, is in IP control, click on tools, naming policies, and make sure you have a policy for your server. So what we expect to happen here is it'll be server dash its IP address hyphenated that was assigned. And that's what we should see when we get the return. So go and do back, and then quantity 5. So our query then, when it goes to that, let's just run it and let's see what we get. All right. And so what we have then, and we should have 5 records that'll give us the IP addresses. And let's see if I can kind of view this. Scroll down a little. All right. So what we have in return then, as you'll see here, is we have IP addresses. There's 5 of these, and they should be in an array structure. And then you can navigate through each of these to see the details that are resulted. So each structure is just an element within the array. This is your array opener, and then your structure, and then you can fill and pull out all these addresses. So the key here is you have not only the new IP address that was assigned, you also have the block selection, and this tells you what subnet was selected to give us the IP addresses in this query. And so what it did is it went out and queried those, found it, and it preferenced 4.0, not only because it was the first subnet on the list, but because it had the API enabled. Now watch what happens when we do this. Let's go back and let's change this subnet 4.0, because we know that's the one it's going to select by default. And let's turn that API on to off. So hopefully it won't select that in this next example. And let's go ahead and run send again. And now this will take a little bit of time, so I might have something else running there. Okay, and that's why I've got it seems to be an error in my string. So, good example of how to look at errors here in troubleshooting. So as you're moving through this, one thing to note on the debug, you'll see date time, but it'll also show you the node. And if you click that, you'll see its red highlight kind of blinking to indicate what's there. So basically what this is telling me is that it couldn't find a block adder, so it really didn't get a subnet back that would work. So I'll tell you what we want to do here. I want to turn on the debug for this. And let's run that again so we can see what happened here. Let's cancel that. And let's send that again. And let's look back in our Node-RED. And in our payload, we only had one subnet, which is right. However, it was not an array. So we should have had child block, so payload child block, block adder. Not sure why I did that, but I did go back and modify my function to get to the subnet where I'm setting down here those values. It's not child block. When I'm updating it, it's actually flattening it out so that the subnet is flat. And so I'm just getting all of the attributes of the child block, so I don't have to go through those dots. So what I've got here then is I just set the blocks to 0. I'll have to come back and check that array. So in my test and in going through my design then, when we do the send again, it should go through, should evaluate all of the fields, and then in the return of this, we're going to get our JSON. So here's our 5 that we've got in return. And what we see here is it's only got the subnets starting with the 3.0 subnet. because we had just turned off the API on, so it knows now that 3.0 is the only one on. And just to kind of go back through some of those settings again, we could effectively go in and modify the 5, enable it, and then we could disable 3 and we could enable 4. Just to see how that works and to make sure it works for the proper selection. So here we want this to be on. Okay, and then I think if we were to run this again, we should get one of the two, probably 4. Actually 5 here. So we got the 5.0 in the display, and if we look at these selections here, it pulled the 5 as being the next available subnet, I'm assuming, in that case. So that's what it determined to be next available. So that's how it works, and that's one example of creating the flows, how you can kind of build in your own functions, using JavaScript. You can set up different debug nodes and enable those along the way, deploying those changes so that as you're trying to debug, and as I was doing, moving this from one server to another, I might have a different format, but I had something wrong, obviously, in the settings. But it enabled me to determine this by evaluating the node that was reporting the error, seeing the structure, understanding what's being passed back to it, and then kind of stepping through the troubleshooting process until I could get my results. Okay, so there's one example of an API. I think we'll come again on the next video, perhaps go through a couple other settings, maybe the subnet, or perhaps some other APIs that you might want to use that aren't tied to the nodes, using just a standard HTTP request into the APIs directly. So we might come back with something like that, and or another test along the way. So thanks again for joining, and look forward to seeing you in the next video.